Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Glen Clark.
Man, that was depressing, David. Jock and I will try to lighten things up a little bit. It's been a long time since I've last spoke at a business summit like this. The last time, some 25 years ago, I don't recall receiving a particularly warm reception. Although looking at those charts, 1996 wasn't bad, I don't think. And I'm still a member of the NDP and a supporter of the current provincial government, so perhaps my reception today will be similar to what it was 25 years ago. My intent here is not to criticize the province. I'll let others do that. Rather, today my intention is simply to make a few suggestions. I'm going to just briefly outline a few things, just 3 or 4 minutes, and then Jock and I are going to talk more casually and take questions. It seems to me that our country and our province has some big economic challenges. We've heard some from David that should command attention by all our elected officials. Per capita GDP decline, stagnant productivity growth, rising government deficits, a housing crisis, healthcare challenges, the opioid crisis, First Nations reconciliation, the rising gap between rich and poor, to name but a few of the big issues facing all levels of government in our country. The provincial government is clearly responding to some of those problems, whether one agrees or not with their approach to housing or healthcare or reconciliation, for example. No one can say they aren't taking action. In addition, the government has produced a number of policy documents: Stronger BC, taking action on BC's forest sector, building on a community's assets to create an economic development strategy, etc., etc., etc. If you look really carefully, you can maybe discern a coherent philosophical approach, although I'm not absolutely certain of that. But the documents, of course, are really just words. Too many of the policy actions the provincial government is taking are at odds with each other. Mass timber promotion on the one hand, while the core primary forest industry is in crisis. Large grants for incremental clean energy to companies that are struggling to survive in their main business. Overdue First Nations reconciliation policy moves that create new uncertainty for existing businesses. This is a government driving multiple policy agendas without, I submit, an overall focus on bigger goals. We should, of course, acknowledge that the province has limited tools to influence economic activity. We live in a small, subnational region with an open economy. As such, we're greatly influenced by monetary policy, geopolitical trends, global trade patterns, and global warming, to name a few overarching currents. But the province does have some important levers. So let me humbly suggest, just to kick this discussion off, 3 just broad ideas. First, in my view, the provincial government needs to switch their focus to more appropriately narrow their focus from wealth distribution to wealth creation. Given our serious economic challenges, all government action needs to be viewed through an economic growth lens. Second, British Columbia must build upon its natural competitive advantages. We are fortunate to live in a province blessed with an abundance of natural resources, and we cannot afford to take this for granted. In recent years, the provincial government has made literally dozens of changes to the rules governing forestry and land use. While each change, in and of itself, may be justified, and each change may indeed be modest, the cumulative impact on industry operating on the land has been devastating. These changes have compounded the effect of massive forest fires and the mountain pine beetle infestation. Today, the BC forest industry is in crisis. Sawmills have closed and more are closing. Harvest levels are down to that which we saw in the 1960s. Pulp mills are unprofitable. BC has generally become something of a swing producer. Sawmills run hard when the commodity price rises and are curtailed when prices are low. The industry is literally a shadow of its former self. Overdue First Nations reconciliation recognition has led the province to myriad policy and governance changes, leading to uncertainty for private investors. I'm not here today arguing against all of those changes. But last year, we only harvested less than 60% of the annual allowable cut and the province's own forecasts suggest the number will be lower in 2024. Even when enough fiber is available, industry does not have access to it. So my second very strong policy suggestion is for the province to stop. Stop making changes. Let business catch up and adapt. We need a lengthy period of stability. How can we recognize the legitimate role of First Nations entitlement and provide the stability necessary for long-term investment in the natural resource sector in British Columbia? How can we ensure that economically and sustainably harvested wood is made available to industry to create jobs? To me, the answer is simple. And my third suggestion, we need to make First Nations true partners in economic opportunity. The way to do that is not as a first step to move to land co-management. Rather, the first step must be revenue sharing. The province absolutely must share royalty and stumpage revenue with First Peoples of BC. I won't pretend today to prescribe the percentage, but it must be meaningful and significant. Industry cannot pay extra fees on top of stumpage and royalties and remain competitive. The government, as a precursor at least to co-management, needs to ensure some of the wealth generated by the land is returned to Indigenous people. Only then will we see a commonality of interest, a true partnership with the private sector. So my three suggestions are pretty simple. Focus on wealth creation, stop making changes to land regulations, and enter into serious discussions with First Nations on revenue sharing. So with that, Jock and I are going to have a little bit more in-depth discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Glenn. You know, when I got up at 6 a.m. this morning, I told my wife, I think she was awake briefly, that I thought by the end of the day I would find myself strongly agreeing with remarks from somebody with the last name of Clark, and it turns out that was the case. So that's great. Listen, just following up on your I think very cogent summary of some of the challenges we've got in BC and maybe some policy directions. I just wanted to dig a little bit into the climate change file, because this we've observed both in Canada and I think here in BC, government's very concerned about tamping down our own emissions, recognizing that Canada's a rather small piece of the overall puzzle, but we obviously have to do our part. And we see nationally, and both here in BC, for example, a strong desire to actually put caps on energy sector emissions, even though energy for Canada is 25% of our entire export basket, a little bit less for BC, but it's growing. If we look at other countries, Norway, Australia, other hydrocarbon producing jurisdictions, they're not doing that. They're taking other kind of strategies or steps to deal with climate change, their own domestic emissions, but trying to ensure that their energy sectors remain competitive. Do you think we've kind of got the balance wrong in BC and Canada on that? And if so, are there any kind of specific steps that you'd recommend to our policymakers to maybe recalibrate that file?
It's a great question, Jock. I do think, I really like what Norway has done, you know, where they generate significant revenue. They don't spend it, at least on operating results. They still have high taxes, but they reinvest it. And of course, they're making great progress on climate change in their own right. I think the challenge in Canada and in British Columbia is there doesn't seem to be any connection or interconnection between all the various policy decisions people make. So everybody's in favor of dealing with climate change, but there are costs and consequences to the various policy actions you're taking, and I don't think people talk about that. I'll tell you a story. I shouldn't tell the story, probably it's a private story, but when I was Premier, the government signed the Kyoto Accord, and I happened to be with the Prime Minister and other premiers at the time in Ottawa. And as a carbon sort of energy producing province, obviously this was of concern to me, or at least of interest to me, and as it was to Ralph Klein at the time in Alberta. And I said to the Prime Minister, I said, look, I don't have any problem with signing Kyoto Accord or dealing with climate change. What's the plan? Like, what's the strategy? Because we produce a lot of energy in British Columbia. And the answer was something like, oh, don't worry about it. It's a UN declaration, doesn't have any teeth, right? And so Canada basically has been signing these accords, going to Rome and going to different places around the world without much thought given to what it means for us. And I think that's what my theme, a little bit of my brief discussion today. You know, I'm in favor of mass timber production, but the core forest industry is in a crisis. It's kind of crazy. You're spending money promoting an industry when the primary industry is suffering. And I think the same way with alternate energy or dealing with global warming. There's nothing wrong, a good idea to look at ways to reduce our environmental footprint, but we have to look at it realistically and what does it mean for us. And too many of the decisions we're making, the lag effect is significant. So everybody's in favor of stuff until the jury, till the chickens come home to roost, and we're kind of there, right? I mean, that's the problem we have in British Columbia. So I don't know. I think it's a pause and reflection would really make sense for British Columbia and for Canada to really back up a second, look at where we're at in the world. Say, we need to exploit our natural resources. That is our competitive advantage, or one of our big competitive advantages. And that shouldn't necessarily preclude significant moves on climate change. It's just that you can't just do one and not think about the other.
Well, it causes me to wonder a little bit about how our population changes over time may have factored into, the decisions and priorities of governments. And I am really struck in the Canadian case, and it's true in BC too, how urban our population has become. I mean, the Canadian population is heavily concentrated in 6 or 7 metro areas across Canada. David mentioned in his presentation that half of British Columbians are sort of jammed into this very small piece of land down here in Metro Vancouver. And it strikes me that, certainly compared to the time that I grew up in Canada, which was before the war, the Afghan war I'm talking about, it strikes me that a growing fraction of our people have no sort of connectivity into this traditional land-based, resource-based economy that really accounts for Canada's wealth creation over time, and it's still very foundational to our global comparative advantage. So you sit in a caucus or around a cabinet table, and 90% of the folks there are representing urban or suburban ridings who the constituents don't necessarily feel that connection. How do we deal with that? That strikes me as a big challenge, particularly for Canada, but for BC too.
I think the Western world has this challenge, of course. I remember being in Saskatchewan talking to the cabinet of Saskatchewan, and every single cabinet minister had either been on a farm, raised on a farm, owned a farm, or had family on a farm. And in British Columbia, we have literally none of that in our cabinet or our government. I think it's a huge challenge, and it's going to get worse. I mean, Canfor, which I'm on the board of, we have a sawmill in Sweden that has maybe 50 people in it, and it would have had 200 or 300 just a few years ago. And with artificial intelligence and automation and robotics, these rural resource communities are being hollowed out by technology. So we have a series of challenges in the Western world. You see it in their politics. You see the urban-rural divide in politics as people in rural Western world are angry at what's happening to their world around them, and you see it in British Columbia and Canada as well. I don't know. It's very challenging. The education around that is different. BC, Vancouver residents particularly are quite fundamentally at its core kind of arrogant, right? They look at this place and they look at where we live and they go, "Wow, this is such a spectacular place. Aren't we privileged?" Without realizing that, so much of our wealth is generated outside of Vancouver. A lot in Vancouver too, and we were developing a nice tech sector and a bunch of other very positive things in British Columbia. But the thing that drives these high-paid jobs has always been our natural resource sector and continues to be. And we're not, and I don't think there's much recognition of that. I think it's a very big challenge for everybody around the world, actually, dealing with this rural-urban divide, both culturally, politically, and economically.
You know, through your career with the Pattison Group in latter years as president and COO, you've had an opportunity, obviously, to look at all the businesses that are part of the larger organization. And I know a lot of those businesses are present in the United States. That's been an important focus area for growth and development. If you had to sort of summarize, and you know, David on his slide talked about our strengths and weaknesses, maybe continuing that conversation through the lens that you kind of had as president of the Pattison Group, in terms of Canada versus the US, where do we have some advantages, and what are the biggest handicaps to deploying capital in Canada compared to the US?
I think our biggest advantage in Canada is the education level. I mean, we really do have a highly literate population. You know, we've had factories in the southern United States where we had to hire teachers to teach people English, and these are older people. So our education system is significantly, I think, positive. So we have stability, and healthcare actually I think is a strength. Notwithstanding all the challenges we have today, but the cost of healthcare and the availability of healthcare is also a strength for Canada relative to the United States. But the U.S. is so darn aggressive and entrepreneurial that businesses drive hard there, much harder than here. It's much more competitive in the United States. It's breathtakingly more competitive in the United States, which is why most Canadian businesses aren't successful in the U.S. And really, one of our keys is we tend to hire Americans to run our American companies because it's a different business. But so I think it's more competitive in the United States. But Canada, the challenge in Canada, I think, is not to choke off the development. Like stability, education, healthcare, those are all good things for capital deployment. I mean, capital, as Jimmy used to say, capital is a coward, right? Capital is going to go where it's the easiest. They're not going to go where it's frightening or where there's nervousness around it, right? And so Canada has had, I think, a competitive advantage in that stable kind of government, stable institutions world. That's partly why I worry about some of the changes in British Columbia, is that uncertainty is just a killer for capital deployment in British Columbia and in Canada. And we have to fix that. We have to clarify the rules and leave them in place and let the market adapt to those new rules if we have rules. In the U.S., you don't see that, right? You just don't see that level of regulation and that level of change, or that stability, actually, frankly. But you do with that lack of stability, you get bigger upsides, right? Less downside, bigger downside, bigger upside in the United States. Canada's a bit more moderate.
You know, you mentioned BC as a small open economy, and of course that's also true for Canada. If we kind of go up to the national level, we're about 2% of the global economy. And it strikes me that that global marketplace is becoming more unforgiving from our perspective, particularly with the the geopolitical tensions we're seeing globally, but also the rise of what I would call neo-mercantilism.
Yep.
That is really infecting, I think, trade and industrial policy across many of the leading economies of the world, including very prominently the United States. And the Trudeau government has come in for quite a bit of criticism, and probably rightly so, for the enormous subsidies that are being thrown at the EV supply chain industry. And the numbers truly are breathtaking. They're up to $60 billion, although most of them are production subsidies, not upfront. Of course, that was triggered by the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, and the fact that the Americans, notwithstanding their putative enthusiasm for free enterprise, are actually making very heavy use of subsidies and incentives to draw investment. We already face challenges without that in Canada. What is the right response? And by the way, BC is getting in a smaller way, is getting into the subsidy game too. I think it's a huge dilemma for us. What's the intelligent response given what our American colleagues are doing?
You forgot the CHIPS Act, which is a massive subsidy as well. Well, I do, Americans have always subsidized their industry by something, and states have always competed with each other for subsidies. And so we've never quite got into that game in Canada, and we shouldn't really. We just have to stick to our core competitive opportunities. I do think, though, and I do worry, that the global trade tensions, Americans become, always has been, but now increasingly protectionist. And so is parts of Europe are now that sort of nativist kind of approach. And that's tough for Canada and tough for British Columbia. I do think we're a little bit Boy Scouts, though, in Canada. There are opportunities. And just to use an example, Canada's relationship with China right now is really tense. And for good reason, I guess. I mean, there was some, the two Michaels were put in detained and those kinds of things. But we can't ignore that we're on the Asia Pacific here, and there's great opportunities in China. Canfor, again, our leadership was just in China. And they said to us, gee, we haven't seen any Canadians here for a number of years. Janet Yellen was there the week before. A whole bunch of American politicians were there, Americans. So they're at war with China, at least rhetorically, but still trying to do business with China. Mm-hmm. Canada's at war with China rhetorically, and then backs away. And I think we have to be careful that we're not, we need trading partners. And the same with we have an India problem with India as well. So I'll just tell one little anecdote. When I was a Minister of Economic Development in British Columbia, I went to Taiwan, and I got a nasty letter by the Chinese consulate saying, how dare you going to we don't recognize Taiwan, you shouldn't be going there. And I was advised by the Canadian external affairs people that said, tell them you're going for business. So I wrote back to them, formally saying, I'm really not going for political purposes. I'm going to promote business. And then that seemed to be okay. And then I landed in Taiwan. I'll never forget landing in Taiwan and looking at all these private planes, like hundreds of private planes, all from mainland China, doing business in Taiwan. And so, business is one thing and politics is another. And I think sometimes in Canada, we conflate the two. And sometimes I think as an open economy, we have to be open to discussing trade with people who we might not like even, or people who we don't share values with, if we're going to be successful, I think. And I think that's increasingly important as the world moves into these kind of protectionist blocks.
You mentioned sort of back to BC for a minute, so you summarized the bumpy decline of the forest products industry. It's been extraordinary to watch it, and I don't think the industry is likely to grow back to the former sort of scale that we had in the past. So that kind of shifts the spotlight maybe to other natural resource-based industries, which collectively are 3/4 of BC's exports. We do have opportunities here, quite significant opportunities in the mining industry. There's a number of major, sort of projects that could advance, a couple that probably will, more that behind them that could. And then on the LNG side, there's the LNG Canada Phase 1 project is nearing completion. There's wood fiber, but there's actually a number of others, at least 3 or 4 other significant ones that could also advance over time, and the global demand does seem to be there. I mean, for BC, as forestry has shrunk, these other resource sectors are looming larger. What would your advice be to BC policymakers around the importance of executing on these opportunities beyond the forest sector over the next few years?
No, I agree. The forestry, I think, can come back quite a ways, actually, if we get it right. So forestry, mining in particular, natural gas, these areas all have tremendous opportunity in British Columbia. The reason I said revenue sharing is because once you pass the UNDRIP legislation, which I remind everybody was passed unanimously, including the Conservatives, everybody supported it, the consequences of that are kind of rolling through the system, and they're undefined. And it's causing all kinds of uncertainty. That's why I think concentrating on revenue sharing, that's royalty sharing, stumpage sharing, et cetera, it becomes much more important, because then there's a value to First Nations being involved because they get some revenue. Yeah. If you move on to the flip side, is that if you concentrate on land management rights for First Nations, then what does the First Nation do if they have a certain right? They're going to stop projects, and they're going to try and negotiate revenue sharing, jobs, etc. Well, there's not enough margin in any of these businesses to pay royalty and to pay stumpage and pay a tax to First Nations. So if you're going to move to co-management at some point or some power for First Nations, it has to be coupled with some revenue associated with that natural resource. And I think if you get that right, then First Nations become enthusiastic partners, obviously very concerned about land use and challenges and environmental protection. So they're not going to be a pushover, but they become at least partners in the discussion because they're going to get some revenue that would have gone to the Crown is now going to them. And I think that can just unleash enormous potential in British Columbia. And I think what governments do, all governments, is they concentrate on things that are easier. Let's try to regulate it. Let's try to give power. Anything except give, meaningful revenue sharing. And it's understandable. I mean, the province used to get about $1.5 billion a year. I mean, stumpage goes up and down with the value as well as volume, but they used to get $1 billion, $1.5 billion a year from forestry direct and stumpage. Last year they got, I think, 400 million or 500 million. It's going to go down again according to their own forecasts. If you share the 400 million 50-50 with First Nations, yes, you lose 200 million, but I'll bet you that 400 million will become, the pie will get bigger. Mm-hmm. And I think the same is true for mining companies and others that are going around looking for opportunities. They are working with First Nations. But what I worry about is the sort of ad hocery. So if you have a lot of margin, say natural gas, maybe you can afford to give more money to First Nations. If you have a mining development and you're trying to get it off the ground, maybe you can do a partnership with First Nations. I would rather see a governmental negotiation around real sharing of revenue with the rules fixed. So foreign investors can come in and say, okay, here's the royalty regime. Half of it's going to go to First Nations, half it to the province. Doesn't matter for the business. What is the regime? And try to get some fixed rules, because stability on rules are critical to making these big, big capital investments. And we don't have it right now in British Columbia.
So a focus kind of on the framework, not these case-by-case deals.
I'd focus on the framework and on negotiations with First Nations. I wouldn't just wave a wand and say, okay, First Nations is going to get so much percentage of revenue. I mean, real negotiations with First Nations on how we're going to share the royalty revenue, how we're going to share stumpage revenue, how we're going to manage the land base, and try to get some clear rules that people can use to make their investment decisions.
That's a good, great point. In the world of the Business Council and other kind of associations, tax policy sort of looms large. There's lots of ideas out there around we need to reform taxes, cut taxes, and yet at the same time, we've got governments running substantial deficits. We've got a lot of pressure on the public sector to actually provide more services. Realistically, do you see much scope in, say, Canada for reducing the tax burden? And secondly, leaving that aside, could we have changes in our tax regime that would make Canada and BC more attractive to deploy capital? Because it is one of the levers that's available to us. And with the Trump tax cuts in particular that were implemented in the U.S. in 2018, some of the advantages that we had in the business world on business taxation have really dissipated. And that seems to coincide with weaker business investment in Canada and more capital outflows to the U.S. So any thoughts you have on that?
No, I think it's the overall tax burden is not going to go down. Let's be honest. I don't think. Could there be shift in tax burden? I think for sure. Shifting away from capital, maybe there could be a shift to consumption taxes, and a variety of those things I think might make us more efficient. But I don't think the overall tax burden. I think the challenge, and the reason why I'm still a social democrat, is that the challenge is we need to run our governments better. Like, if you believe that government can play a positive role, and some people in this room probably don't, but if you believe that governments can play a positive role, it has to be run efficiently. In other words, it has to have the trust and legitimacy to run efficiently. I saw the trust numbers in government in Canada are like, 25, 30%. I mean, trust in Sweden, people trust the government in Sweden, it's 70%, I think. In Finland, it's 80%. So there's support for government because government is run better. And I think the challenge we have, if you believe that there could be a role for government, is to run them better. And if you look at the sort of costs of government, they're really clearly driving higher. You saw the per capita numbers up there, and I don't know. We got more efficient government. I mean, I do think there is tremendous opportunity for artificial intelligence and other things to improve circumstances. You know, in the private sector, or in the last 25 years I've been working in, you know, when you go to work, every single day you go to work is, how do we cut costs? How do we improve productivity? How do we drive more revenue? How do we make the place more efficient? That's the whole mentality. If you're not doing that, you're going to fall behind. And I think some of that in the government sector, it seems to me to be much more important than I think we've thought in the past. We need to drive the efficiency into the system so that our tax burden doesn't rise, but rather is reallocated to more efficient government resources.
So you just there's at least one
one supporter.
You know, it occurs to me. I remember a conversation I had with you a few years after you joined Mr. Pattison, and he pointed out something that I either forgotten or never knew, and that is, you know, the provinces in particular, the vast majority of what they're doing and where they're spending money and collecting money is really to provide these 3 or 4 core services: right. Healthcare, education, social services, and what I would call infrastructure services. Right. And that's not going to go away. So being more kind of specific, are there models of other jurisdictions, for example, that do it better on healthcare or on social services, where we can get more of a bang for the buck? Because the demand isn't going to diminish. Yeah. The ability to continue to pay more taxes to fund this stuff, I think, is under question. So, you know, that efficiency drive that you're mentioning is critical, but how do we take the next step and execute on it?
Well, I think the Scandinavians do a much better job on social services. They have a much more active labor market kind of strategy to get people back into the workforce. There's strains now, actually, interestingly enough, in Scandinavian countries with new immigration, right, which doesn't have, which is causing some serious challenges politically in those countries. But there is, I think, you know, having a more active labor market kind of approach to social services really makes sense to me, rather than just giving people money. And so sort of the retraining, the reintroduction of the workforce, driving that kind of momentum and putting resources where you can is important. I think in healthcare there's tremendous opportunity with new technology. And I do worry that governments are behind in Canada on that. I mean, I'm sure there's innovation going on that we're not seeing, but big data and the changes that I see every day in my work life is just breathtakingly. Yeah. Yeah. It's both negative and positive, but the positive side is I think healthcare lends itself to big data. If you can really drive optimum outcomes and optimum change, I think there's real opportunity. You know, I'm working for Rogers, and some of the telecommunications strategy and investment that's being made, you know, billions of dollars in British Columbia as a result of the Shaw acquisition, is going to open up, I think, telemedicine and other ways, which will also reduce, I think, the physical infrastructure and improve efficiencies for people. But I think the problem, I think, with government, to belabor this, is people work hard. You see this in business as well. You know, you get this big system with deputy ministers and ministers and staff all working hard, sort of administering a program. And very few sort of stepping back and saying, okay, how can we do this more efficiently? Why are we doing it this way? Why can't we change things? In business, you see that. You know, they got the rank and file, if you will. Workers are working hard, the managers, the foremen, et cetera. And the role of leadership often is actually not to help them run things, but to step back and look at what you can do more efficiently and how you can change it and why you're doing things. And I think there's just not enough of that, I think, happening in the public sector. And it's not because people aren't working hard. It's not because there isn't stuff to do. It's that innovation and the ability to sort of really look at it holistically to see if we can't make significant step changes in cost, for example, or productivity.
I mean, a lot of economists would say that the way to drive productivity improvement, efficiency improvement, is to introduce more competition. So that, I mean, it's a challenge on the public sector side, but I would say in Canada, there's a kind of emerging debate that says we don't have enough competitive intensity in our markets, in our private sector markets, for network services. We've got too many restrictions on foreign investment. We've got too many interprovincial trade barriers. And these features of our kind of political economy are part of the reason why we're struggling so much on productivity. Do you have any kind of thoughts on that?
It's definitely less competitive in Canada than it is in the U.S. I think it's more competitive in Canada than it is in the U.K., for example. You know, I really do think Canadians do really well in the U.K. historically, and do really poorly in the U.S. Business people, and I think there's a kind of a reason for that. But there's lots of opportunity, I think, in Canada to improve competition, and we need to do that. I mean, it's clear. It's clear that what drives. I mean, innovation's a complicated formula, right? It's not just taxes, or it's some of it's wages. You know, if you in the U.S., wages are arriving a lot faster than Canada, and wages are driving up in the U.S., and that's driving businesses to innovate and to invest in robotics, et cetera. And I literally, personally have been involved in that, because you can see wages just driving higher in the U.S. And in Canada, you know, doesn't go high, doesn't go low, and we don't have that same kind of drive to make competitive changes. Some of that's immigration, in my judgment. Too much immigration right now in Canada, which is keeping wages low, which business always thinks is good for them, but ultimately it leads to a replacement of capital with labor. It leads to lower wages overall, and therefore a more stagnant and less dynamic economy, in my view. So I think there's real opportunities for that. Less immigration, higher wages, actually, driving innovation, probably a better tax regime on capital investment, and seeing if we can't really, really stimulate the productivity side of the Canadian economy.
Just, we're running out of time. I just wanted to touch on one other topic I know is of interest to my former colleagues at the Business Council, and that is the market penetration of electric vehicles. I know in your previous role, obviously, the Jim Pattison Group's got a large retail automobile business, a huge one, and the EV sort of evolution is obviously a critical strategic trend for that sector. We're seeing conflicting kind of data points on how quickly EVs are penetrating the market. Some of the big automobile manufacturers are stepping back from previous investments. The big Japanese producers seem to be opting for hybrids rather than EVs. Your thoughts on the sector, because governments are betting quite heavily on EVs, both to get emissions down, but also in the Canadian context as a new industrial development opportunity.
Well, Canada's kind of unique, right? Because they don't work that well in cold climates. Like, they really don't, at least at the moment. They're about 50% of the mileage or the kilometers you get. And so they don't sell any EVs. I'm exaggerating, but basically there's no EVs being sold in Saskatchewan or Manitoba or northern British Columbia or northern Canada. It's interesting. The EV growth in British Columbia is driven by the government subsidy, and nobody should be under any illusion about that. The Ford government in Ontario eliminated the subsidy, and the sales went to like zero. Quebec has an even more sort of draconian thing. They require manufacturers to sell a certain percentage of EVs, and so they get actually the first call on EVs. BC's sort of second, and then everywhere else it doesn't really matter. So I mean, we met with all the industry, and they're all believing that things are going to electrify. The Japanese are a bit of an exception. They really like the hybrid and even the plug-in hybrids, and not going full electric. But anybody that's been to China in the last couple of years, I mean, the EV revolution is clearly happening, whether we like it or not. I just don't know if it's happening as fast as people predicted. I think it's not. I mean, I think it's, Jacques, it's the market, right?
Yeah.
If gas is cheap and EVs are more expensive, people are not going to pay the premium for that. So I think as the market changes, it's going to be ironic, because if it really does take off and gasoline prices might come down, it'll keep the business keep business going longer.
Well,
remember, Canada is almost all pickups, right?
Yeah.
It's really unique. If you look at the numbers, it's actually striking. I mean, it's more than half the cars sold in Canada are pickup trucks, and they'll probably be a little bit later to electrify than everything else.
Well, we've used up our time. I really want to thank you on behalf of the audience for sharing your insights with us this morning. It's been a privilege for me to have the opportunity to pose a few questions for you. So thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, John.